For supporters of Sudan's military, it was the most dramatic run of good news in nearly a year. On January the 26th, Sudanese armed forces successfully ran a blockade around the city of Dilling in South Kordofan, bringing relief to the tens of thousands trapped there. Barely had the celebratory posts on social media died down before another siege was broken, this time around Kadugli, where the SAF rode in triumph on February the 3rd. As analyst Clément Molin wrote on X shortly after the Dilling breakthrough, it is the biggest victory for the SAF since they liberated the capital city of Khartoum a year ago. But while opening access to two besieged cities was undoubtedly a major win, it was how these victories fit into the war's wider context that made them so important. Just a couple of months ago, the SAF seemed to be on the back foot. Their opponents, the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, had just seized full control of Darfur. Much of the central Kordofan region was in danger of falling to them. At their most apocalyptic, there were even warnings that the paramilitaries might soon return to the gates of Khartoum. But the SAF instead seized the initiative is a major upset, one that could have huge ramifications for Sudan's war. Yet for the wider world, the more interesting part might be why Sudan's military is suddenly on a roll. Because rather than the tactical genius of its commanders, it's almost certainly to do with elements happening behind the scenes. Events that could reshape not just the Sudanese conflict, but the entire Red Sea region. Days of thunder. Now, the last time WarFronts checked in on the war in Sudan, it was with a dire warning. On January the 17th, we noted that the RSF and its allies had besieged multiple cities in the Kordofan region and seemed poised to repeat the tactics that had successfully delivered them the North Darfur capital of El Fasher. In that case, a siege of over 550 days had led to famine. When the RSF finally broke through, they'd slaughtered something in the region of 60,000 people in a week, with some estimates going as high as 100,000. So the idea they might do something similar in Kordofan felt terrifyingly real. And while our warning focused on the still surrounded city of El Obeid, we also noted that Kadugli to the south was in extreme danger. To quote our own coverage, the International Rescue Committee warns the Kordofan risks seeing more massacres or even another El Fasher should more of these towns fall to the Rapid Support Forces. By this point, the RSF and their allies in the Sudan People's Liberation Movement North had cut the road between Dilling and Kadugli and encircled both towns. Analysts like the Critical Threats Project were warning that preparations appeared to be underway for a ground invasion of both. So, you can imagine our surprise when the news flooded our feeds just 9 days later. News that the SAF and their allies in the joint forces had managed to run the blockade of Dilling 160 kilometers south of El Obeid. There's video footage of people on the streets cheering their liberation. Initially, it seemed like a ray of good news, but only a weak ray, like a sunbeam seen through the grimiest window. Word came out that the SAF had only managed to sneak through the encirclement with supplies rather than truly break the siege. In other words, relief, but in its mildest form. And then came the news of heavy battles along the road to Kadugli. News that was quickly followed by another flood of videos on social media, this time showing Kadugli's residents cheering as the military rode into town. By late February the 3rd, a mere 17 days after we ended our last Sudan video with a gloomy assessment for the future, it was clear that the SAF had broken both sieges. After months of famine, goods were flowing into Dilling and Kadugli, all while the military appeared ready for further campaigning. As the Critical Threats Project noted, quote, "The SAF's advance sets conditions for it to reconnect Dilling, El Obeid, and Kadugli, which would relieve pressure on El Obeid and create a potential second axis of advance toward the RSF's center of gravity in Western Sudan." At the time of recording, early-ish on Friday, the next advance has yet to unfold. El Obeid remains at risk, and despite a defiant speech from SAF leader General al-Burhan that the military would liberate Darfur, a drive west has yet to materialize. There's even been an RSF victory down in Blue Nile State as they and their allies open up a new front along the borders with South Sudan and Ethiopia. But let's not nitpick. The events in Kordofan are a huge deal for the military supporters. 3 weeks ago, analysts, and I'll include us among them, were worried the RSF might effectively seize Kordofan. Today, experts like Cameron Hudson are posting on X that, and we'll quote him here, "The momentum shift in the conflict suggests the army is on a trajectory toward retaking much of the country, even Darfur." End quote. Whether that happens or not, it is impossible to say right now, but what we can say is that the SAF's sudden boost isn't just thanks to its commanders getting their mojo back. Rather, it's due to a complex shifting of alliances that's taking place behind the scenes. A shift that may wind up remaking much of the Red Sea region from Sudan to the wider Middle East. A shift that seems to be being driven by a growing rivalry between two of America's closest Gulf allies, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Best of enemies. The fall of El Fasher last October marked one of the few times that Sudan's war has broken through into the global consciousness. We alluded to the horrors of the start of the last chapter, the mass killings that accompanied the RSF's victory, killings that left bloodstains visible on satellite imagery and may have resulted in more civilians dying in 1 week than died during the entire Gaza war. But while the sheer brutality on display briefly made the rest of the world sit up and take note, the impact was far greater in the capitals of Sudan's neighbors. In Cairo, the New York Times reports that President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi of Egypt was visibly alarmed by the news, later warning that a red line had been crossed. In the Saudi capital of Riyadh, the reaction seems to have been even more extreme. Within weeks of El Fasher's fall, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was in Washington begging President Trump to help stop the war. This diplomatic track was accompanied by practical steps. Almost as soon as the Trump meeting had finished, the Saudis were beginning to increase material support to the SAF. And not just the Saudis. Recent weeks have seen advanced Turkish drones appear in the skies above Sudan supporting the military. While the SAF have long had access to Bayraktar TB2s, these new drones are the far more capable Akinci variety. What's more, the Times reports that they're being flown out of an airbase in Egypt. Now, before we get into the battlefield impact of all of this, we have to try and trace the geopolitics behind it all. Because Riyadh, Cairo, and Ankara didn't suddenly decide to go all in on backing the SAF just out of humanitarian concern over El Fasher. Rather, they did so because of the nation that is almost single-handedly keeping the RSF in the fight, the United Arab Emirates. Although they deny it, the UAE has long been involved in Sudan's civil war, shipping arms and money to the RSF via airbases in Chad and Libya, and treating their fighters in Emirati hospitals. There are multiple reasons why Abu Dhabi backs the paramilitaries, most of which we've covered in previous videos. The access RSF provide to Sudan's lucrative goldfields, the feeling Emirati leader Mohammed bin Zayed appears to have that he owes the group its support for joining the joint Saudi-UAE intervention in Yemen. But perhaps the biggest one is that the UAE believes the SAF are too close to Sudan's Islamist elements. And one of UAE's foreign policy goals is to stymie the rise of political Islam, especially as it relates to the Muslim Brotherhood. Since the RSF presents itself as an explicitly secular force, it seems a better bet in Abu Dhabi's eyes. Now, this is more or less the exact opposite of how Saudi Arabia views the war. As the Atlantic Council writes, Saudi officials view a state army such as the SAF as far preferable to a militia such as the RSF, which they regard as unpredictable, institutionally weak, and lacking legitimacy. End quote. The Saudis believe an RSF-led Sudan could spread instability along the Red Sea, which makes up the kingdom's western border. And spreading instability is precisely what Riyadh loathes about the UAE's current foreign policy. In recent years, Abu Dhabi has backed armed factions in both Sudan and Yemen, supported the separatist government of General Haftar in Libya, and the breakaway state of Somaliland in Somalia. As the European Council on Foreign Relations notes, quoting, Saudi frustration with Emirati activism has grown steadily in recent years. Despite Saudi Arabia and the UAE strategic partnership, the former increasingly views the latter's assertive foreign policy as a source of instability. Beyond that, there's the growing partnership between UAE and Israel. With Jerusalem emerging from its wars with Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran as a new regional hegemon, Riyadh worries it is losing out from the Middle East's new order. As the same article notes, the deepening UAE-Israel partnership, which extends to Saudi Arabia's western flank in Yemen, the Red Sea, and the Horn of Africa, now raises fears of strategic encirclement in Riyadh. End quote. Meanwhile, Cairo has more prosaic words. Despite long backing the SAF, Egypt also has deep ties with the UAE, the Emirates having invested billions in the nation. On the other hand, Egypt borders Sudan. And there's little that would be less welcome in Cairo than the thought of a genocidal militia taking over the country and driving millions to flee north across the border. Nor is Cairo thrilled about the growing ties between UAE and Ethiopia, a country it regards as a danger thanks to Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's expansionist rhetoric and the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which Cairo fears will hoard water Egypt needs to flow up the Nile. In short, there's a whole lot of complex geopolitics swirling around the edges of Sudan's war, but until recently, that stuff mostly remained in the shadows. UAE funded and armed the RSF, while the SAF's allies mostly fretted on the sidelines. Until now, because what's changed in the last couple of months is that Riyadh, Cairo, and Ankara have got off the sidelines and committed to a more full-throated backing of the military. And that, in turn, has fueled the SAF's recent run of victories. And we will get into those victories in just a moment. But first, do you ever find yourself wishing that WarFronts could cover more stories and go into even more depth? Well, to quote Futurama's Professor Farnsworth, good news, everyone! Fronts.co is our new subscriber site for those who want to dig deeper into the stories of the day. For just $5 a month, you get access to 2 exclusive videos each and every week, plus in-depth articles written by actual experts. Just recently, we carried an interview with Sudan's ambassador on the course of the war, as well as an in-depth video on how the UAE helps keep the RSF afloat. And Sudan isn't all we cover. We also dug into the experiences of Iranian protesters captured by the regime, as well as Turkey's plans for a new Middle East realignment. If you like this video, you'll probably like Fronts.co. It's $5 a month, and now let's get back to the shifting course of the war in Sudan. Intervention. So as warnings go, they don't get more direct than the one that Egypt delivered to the RSF on November the 5th. That day, a convoy of trucks carrying supplies to the paramilitaries crossed out of eastern Libya and into the deserts of northwest Sudan. Moments later, missiles fired from a Turkish drone operated from an Egyptian airbase slammed into the convoy. Images of trucks ablaze would later surface on social media, a warning to the rest of the paramilitaries. As a source later told Middle East Eye, the strike sent a clear message. No movement in the Al-Uwanat Triangle between Libya, Egypt, and Sudan will be tolerated. Any military trucks or supply convoys moving from Libya to support the RSF would face the same fate. End quote. The warning is one the RSF has been forced to take seriously. As our own writer, Evan, recently put it, the assumption by UAE and RSF was never that those convoys couldn't be targeted, but that they wouldn't be. If Egypt is willing to hit them without them having to stray onto Egyptian soil, then it's immediately understood by UAE/RSF that they're sitting ducks and the situation is untenable. End quote from Evan there. The November strike was one of the earliest steps in what has emerged as a coordinated campaign to strangle the RSF by cutting off routes the UAE uses to resupply it. A campaign that has included closing Saudi and Egyptian airspace to Emirati cargo flights deemed to have weapons on board, as well as the closing of Somali ports to ships carrying material for the war. A campaign that has also seen the bigger powers strong-arm one of the RSF's longtime backers into dropping its support. This story comes via Middle East Eye and is what you might call juicy as. For a long time, eastern Libya has been under the sway of a UAE-backed strongman known as General Haftar. And Haftar has been instrumental in keeping the RSF afloat, delivering fuel from Libya's own refineries and allowing the use of Al-Kufra airport for the UAE to fly in weapons. Well, according to a story from mid-January, the Egyptian government summoned Haftar's son to Cairo, where he was given a brutal dressing down for his father's work with the paramilitaries. That done, he was shown a supposed secret Emirati plan to divide Libya into zones of influence that would have seen Haftar's territory broken up before being offered financial backing to replace lost UAE support. How much of that is embellished is hard to say, but what's clear is that it worked. Al-Kufra airport has been shut down to flights, and so far it appears that RSF supply lines from Libya have been disrupted or outright erased. Now, that's not to say that the paramilitaries have lost all means of resupply. There are signs that UAE-aligned Ethiopia is allowing its territory to be used to support the RSF, while South Sudan also appears to be swinging behind the paramilitaries. And despite recent clashes between the RSF and Chadian forces, some supply routes from Chad still appear to be operating. A senior lecturer at the School of Security Studies at King's College London, Andreas Krieg, told Turkish outlet Anadolu Ayasi, Quoting the original article's paraphrasing here, while RSF logistics are being pressured, they have not been broken. Still, the paramilitaries are certainly getting squeezed, and the realignment of multiple neighbors into a bloc designed to contain the UAE would suggest that squeeze will only get tighter. All of which raises a major question. Given all the events behind the scenes, what might the impact be on the course of Sudan's war? Battlefield dilemmas. In celebrating the SAF's recent victories, the head of the military government, General al-Burhan, did not act coy. In a press statement, he vowed to send his forces into Darfur, flush out the paramilitaries, and recapture, quote, every inch of Sudan. This is somewhat remarkable in light of ongoing claims from Trump's senior advisor on African affairs, Mossad Boulos, that a joint peace plan has already been agreed between the US, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the UAE. And it suggests a fundamental truth of the conflict. Neither side is going to back down while they feel like they're still able to win. The question, of course, is whether that feeling is simply that, a vague, warm feeling born of victory and divorced from military reality. And the opinion of most analysts appears to be that the SAF just isn't strong enough to liberate the entire country. In his interview with AA, Andreas Krieg claimed that the SAF might be able to take control of key roads and garrisons in Kordofan and eventually bottle the RSF up in Darfur, preventing them from moving eastward. In his words, Kordofan is where the Sudanese armed forces could plausibly generate momentum because it sits at the hinge between the center and the west. End quote. But he also maintained that an SAF drive into Darfur to liberate territory was unlikely, or at least one that successfully managed to hold any towns it retook. Zooming out a bit further, there are other compounding problems that the SAF is having to face. The biggest is likely the new front the RSF and their allies in the SPLM North opened up in the southern state of Blue Nile. Here's how Akled's report described it. The RSF's decision to push the fight to the SAF in Blue Nile is crucially aimed at reopening the contest for control of central Sudan, Khartoum, Sennar, and Al Jassar estates. Should the RSF wrest control of Blue Nile, this would open routes towards Sennar, which the SAF has held since early 2025. End quote. Already, the paramilitaries have had early successes capturing crucial villages, but even if their attempts ultimately don't lead to the loss of much territory, the fact that the RSF appears to have struck across the border from Ethiopian territory would suggest that Addis Ababa is weighing up more forceful intervention in the war. And it's here that we get to the worry of today's episode, that these latest behind-the-scenes maneuvers are not the last, and that the advantage may not stay with the SAF forever. Right now, the military is on a roll because the coalition backing it has managed to stymie the UAE in multiple places. In Yemen, for example, a Saudi-backed group seemed to have all but wiped out an Emirati-backed one. But while that might suggest that the UAE is weaker than it appears, it could also bode ill for Sudan. As regional expert Cameron Hudson noted on X, I hear that UAE has already made clear that their accommodation of Saudi demands ends in Yemen and would not extend to Sudan. I'm expecting UAE to double down there again. In other words, the humiliation in Yemen may convince Abu Dhabi to throw even more support behind the RSF, to try and rope in Ethiopia and South Sudan if necessary, or perhaps find some way of disrupting the SAF's suppliers in turn. If that happens, then the main outcome will be a continuation of this new scramble for Africa, one in which powers in the MENA region fight over the spoils of the world's worst war, while those who suffer the most remain the civilians of Sudan. Thank you for watching.